Today's webinar is Ask the XPages Experts, and we have a great lineup of experts, and you can see those on my screen right now. So each expert in turn will start off with just about a 5-minute discussion, presentation, demonstration on a particular topic of XPages interest. And then we're going to follow up with an open Q&A. Now, during the presentation, at any time, you can post your questions into the questions pane, and then we'll be fielding those, all providing a voice for your questions later on when we get into the Q&A part of the demonstration. For those who tweet, certainly a tag that's worth adding is the XPages tag. That's worth following, and you'll see a lot of our experts participate and tweet along that particular hashtag. Just a mention of an upcoming webinar next month. Mark your calendars for August 15th, deploying and managing XPages applications. So Warren Elsmores from Blue Wave Group will give us a look at XPages, not from a development perspective, but from more of an administration perspective, you know, how to deploy and manage those XPage applications. A little bit about TLCC. We have 6 XPages courses. We also offer courses on all Domino development topics and Domino administration topics and user topics as well, using notes, same time, quicker. We have a free Introduction to XPages development course. If you haven't downloaded that, you can come to our site to try that out. And we have topics like JavaScript for XPages, a couple of XPage development courses, specifically a mobile XPage development course, and just last month we introduced our Java 1 for XPages development course. And as its name implies, we're going to follow that up with a Java 2 for XPage development course. Certainly a very powerful tool to add to your arsenal as you're going down this path of developing your XPage development skills, so certainly have a look at that. In terms of delivery, we deliver our courses as self-paced training. There is instructor support for those, which we deliver through discussion databases for courses, and we also have instructor hours where a couple of times a month you can join Howard and I during our instructor hours in an online format with any specific questions that you may have. We can also deliver our training as instructor-led training, either online or on-site, and we provide mentoring services as well. There is a special deal for any webinar attendees. Up until July 31st, you can get 20% off any TLCC course. Just visit that page before you order. And on my screen now is a listing of our XPages experts and the topics that they'll be presenting. So Chris Toohey is going to start us off with a look at duplicating the Lotus Notes client application look and feel using Dojo and XPages. Tim's going to follow that with, I guess, the other side of that coin. Creating a flexible user interface using repeat controls. Paul's going to follow up with a discussion on XPages language from a performance perspective, and Howard's going to follow up with that one, kind of related, just a look at DB lookup versus document by key and who wins that performance race. So first off, we're going to start with Chris Toohey. And Chris is with GBS. He's out of Allentown, Pennsylvania. His title at GBS is a short one, Guru. And he's also the Domino Guru. So some of you may follow his blog at dominoguru.com. Chris is recognized as an expert, certainly in XPages and other Domino topics. He's been recognized as an IBM champion, and you can follow Chris at Chris Toohey on Twitter. Chris, good morning.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Let me just make sure I share out the right screen. There we go. If you can see the mobile address book context view, you're looking at the right screen. I think we've all seen a personal address book, and I tend to use personal address books as my demo applications because everyone knows what they do. And I have my contact listed in here just for an example. And I wanted to show you how you can take this application as is over to the web using a lot of the XPages core extension library controls and straight up Dojo. And I'm also a fan of showing the end result first and sort of reverse engineering. So this is what we're looking at here. We've abandoned any One UI v2.1 user interface design and went with a would-be traditional Lotus Notes frame set approach. And we're using a Dojo control called the border container. And in that border container, it's basically an Ajaxified or an Ajaxian enabled frame set. So instead of loading individual pages per se, you're loading those via Ajax, pulling that in, pulling in the content, stripping the content between the body tags, and if you carry over all of your SSJS functions as resources across the pages, all you'll need to do is reparse, use the Dojo parser to rebind the events, and you've got it fully functional. So I'll just walk you through the basics here, then we'll crack open the code. So I can go in between views. You see it offers a nice little loading screen. If I get down to, if it throws an error, there's an option for a custom error message, but it's fast responsive. This is actually hitting a live server, so this isn't coming off of a local VM, and it's that fast. I mean, this thing flies. And what it offers is the ability to reach out to external databases. We'll go over that in a second. So I'll open up, and pardon the garish look, but if you look at the personal address book, it ain't much better. Putting that into edit mode here. So you see it's an exact duplication, if you will. There's a few buttons that I didn't wire, but you'll get the idea. And there's that paradigm shift of going from the Lotus Notes client where everything opens up in a new tab, and I've found that users hate that when you're going to a web browser, so we stayed away from that. Going under the hood, let me open up Domino Designer. There's a multi-client architecture that I tend to employ, which is essentially create a home page or create a master page, and then create device-specific pages. So I can use progressive enhancement techniques. If I'm developing this for a tablet, or the iPad versus the iPhone, there's obvious screen real estate versus functionality versus touch screen versus mouse click that I can take advantage of and actually develop to the device while still bringing the full feature fidelity of the application. So what that looks like is essentially this. I have a home page. The home page pulls in a layout control. The layout control I'll show in a second. It has a callback facet which passes through a page, basically an include page. This include page checks the session scope. What's my user agent variable, if you will, for the UA. Now the UA is actually defined within my script library. Now a lot of these script libraries are core to the personal address book, so I really only added a screen and core. But get UA pulls back, and I basically do a lot of if processing on the user agent. A, does it contain the word mobile, and it's probably a mobile device, and then it offers overrides. Well, if it's Android and it says tablet, then we're It doesn't contain the word mobile. It's a tablet otherwise. Mobile, iPhone, Playbook, give it a tablet. If it's BlackBerry but does not contain WebKit, give it a BlackBerry UI, which is the old 320 by 240 displays, and we can customize the look and feel there. But the idea here is you include the page, home underscore, and there's the page variable, home underscore the value you return. So if I'm pulling this up over a mobile device, it's going to return home underscore mobile. So this basically acts as a shell. And then I can create device-specific functionality off of that. But getting to the meat of it, in fact, you can see here the home mobile just says mobile home. Not to be confused with a mobile home. This is the home page for mobile devices. So I have here my home underscore screen page. And this includes various XPages settings, very basic stuff. I'm including the screen JavaScript, client-side JavaScript library. And I have a custom control named layout screen. Now, what I've done here is create, and the idea would be that you create different layouts per, or layout controls per device need, or device that you're supporting. So I'll go into layout screen. As I'm already over my 5-minute time limit, I'll try to make this fast, yet still be informative. So I'm using the extension library Dojo border container and wiring everything to properties. So I've got my border container, I've got my Dojo content panes, which basically make up the body content of these frames, or the frame content of the frame sets. So right here is a content pane, this area is a content pane, and so on and so forth. But with the border container and a content pane, you can actually set an href target. So you can pull up a URL. Again, it's an AJAX pull. So I can actually pull this href in and pull up a page. Let's take a look at this page and the content that I'm pulling here. This is actually going to be view underscore screen. And as you can see, it's an exact representation here. However, to get the different views, I don't have view underscore in 50 different views. I'm actually using on the view underscore screen a Dojo control for the dynamic view panel. Now, there are scalability issues. You can't really have 5,000 people hitting this concurrently and expect it to perform properly. And there are limitations. Tim's actually going to go into completely breaking the mold that this control and view panel controls actually set. There are hacks and there are ways to get around it, but on a whole, it's this WYSIWYG type of drag and drop, boom, it's there. That rad development with these view panels does limit you in what you present to the user. So Tim's going to be going over that shortly. But that's basically the idea. We have a dynamic view panel. Now, leveraging the inherent query string parameter friendly data sources. I'm actually just saying, okay, if I'm not passing anything, oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. The view panel just takes over where the data is defined as people. So it's getting the people view off of this current database. However, if I take a look at the layout screen, which my notes client just froze, let's go to the home screen. Let's go to the layouts. So I'll actually define custom properties, and I'll start building this out here. So if I wanted to, I could change this to a headline type layout where it actually displays across the top. The border container is actually extremely flexible. Especially with this, it brings rad to that layout. So I can start playing around with the options here. I can set that I don't want a bottom, so I can turn that off. or if I want to turn that on, I just set that to true. I'll save, refresh. And there you've got your footer section there if you wanted to include that. So it's extremely flexible. It's really, you can start playing around and get what you want in there. But I have a navigator, and the way that the dynamic control works, I have a navigator, basic leaf node, and all I'm doing is calling a client-side function, client-side JavaScript function, setFrameHref, passing it a global client-side JavaScript variable that I've created using the technique I call XPages artifacting, and pass it the view.xsp with the view name that I want, view name being a reserved query string parameter that actually wires a view data source. And that's it. I mean, outside of actually wiring the pages, wiring the buttons, making it pretty, that's it. You could pretty much drop this type of architecture into any application, tweak it as you need, and quickly ramp up a browser-based version. Of course, it's not as visually appealing as something that Tim's going to show you. This goes for that 100% complete fidelity. You should even add the vertical category selector, the alphanumeric, all A, B, C, D, E, F, G that you can see on the Notes client version. But that's basically the idea, is that this is another option using the core Dojo controls to create a UI or enhance a UI. And you can even marry this with some more aggressive designs and layout schemas, so you have that expando pane control with Dojo. You can slide things in, slide things out, and really get a slick-looking dashboard-style user interface that's different from what we typically see as XPages applications, which is really the One UI v2.1 layout. I am well over my time. I apologize for that, but thank you very much. And if you guys have any questions, I'll be sticking around for the Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. And let me introduce our next presenter. So are you seeing my screen? Anyone confirm that? Okay. Our next speaker is Tim Tripconi, also with GBS, out of the Atlanta area. His title is XMage, and I'll get him to explain that. I've asked him 3 or 4 times to explain that to me, but maybe it's worth doing one more time. His blog is Tip of the Iceberg, and you can visit that at www.timtripconi.com. Tim is one of the authors of the new book, XPages Extension Library. If you haven't purchased this book, go out and get it now. If you're not using the extension library, start now. Really good stuff in there. You can also follow Tim on Twitter at Tim Tripconi, and he's also an IBM champion. Tim, what are you going to share with us today?
Well, as Chris inferred or implied, we're going to be taking a look at some alternate user interface techniques, going just a little bit beyond the typical view panel approach. So, in terms of my job title, Nathan Freeman assigned that to me as a nickname years ago because the old cliche of any technology we don't understand looks like magic. In our early days of exploring XPages, he jokes that that the types of things he was seeing me do at XPages looked like magic to him. Obviously, we've since discovered that that was more a reflection of the platform than necessarily, my specific approaches. But the nickname stuck and has since become my official job title. So I guess I should show my screen then, huh? which, are you seeing my browser or same time?
Same time.
Okay. So, excuse me. So as Chris mentioned, a lot of XPage applications just take advantage of the built-in One UI variant themes that IBM ships with the platform. And so here we're looking at a very representative XPage application. And so, you know, we've got a data set that we can see, you know, a summary of, and it's very reminiscent of Notes views. And further reminiscent of Notes applications, I can resort the exact same data set by selecting a different view. And so that's great. The advantage of the technique that Chris was showing is that there's almost no training required. You have a user using the Notes app one day, you give them a URL the next day, and they're going to know exactly what to do because it looks identical. The trouble is, websites don't actually look like this. Websites tend to look usually a little bit something more like this. Now, one could argue that while this is the same information, this is much more succinct, right? You can see everything you need to see without even scrolling. But user interface, human user-computer interaction studies have shown that that people respond differently to different ways of presenting the same information. So while I need to scroll a little bit further to absorb the same information in this context, I'm more likely to absorb and comprehend what I'm looking at because it's presented. If I'm seeing everything at once, then I'm not really absorbing what I'm looking at. So this presents a little bit more meaning in a different context. So also, rather than having the same information sorted different ways based on a navigation, people have come to expect user interfaces where they can do something like this and you know, resort the information sort of within the same page, as opposed to treating it like I'm going somewhere else entirely just to do a different sorting of the same information. So let's quickly take a look at how we accomplish this alternate type of user interface. So the first page we looked at was very predictable. We've got a view panel, and it's bound to a domino view data source, and then, you know, the view columns, etc. So going from that sort of, here's what IBM gave me, I'm just going to use what I was given sort of interface, to a completely custom, I'm going to show what I want to show kind of interface. It's actually not that difficult of a leap. So let's jump over to the slightly fancier page. Now, instead of defining a view panel, I'm just using a regular panel, and then I've bound a panel-specific data source. Now, it's still a domino view, but instead of hard-coding the view name, like I'm doing here, instead of assuming a view name, all I'm doing is creating an association between the value of a combo box and the view I want to bind it to. So in this case, I'm creating select items that have a display name the user is going to find intuitive, but the actual value of the field is just the alias for what view I want to use. So every time the user chooses a different sorting criteria, the data source immediately updates, and we're now associated with a completely different view. So then we've got a repeat control. And if I won't belabor what exactly repeat controls are because there's so much information about them scattered across the internet. But essentially a repeat is just a blank canvas that you can put anything into, but whatever you put inside of it is going to be repeated once for each member of either a collection or just a number. And I'll briefly touch on that latter point in just a moment. So in this case, the repeat is just bound to the view. So we're iterating the exact same data that we would be if we were using a view panel, but now we have complete control over what we're doing inside that iteration. So for each instance of each view entry, essentially, I'm creating a nested panel and defining a domino document data source, just like we would if we had an XPage that was analogous to a form. And then I'm binding the document ID to the document ID of the view entry. So what that means then is inside each of these represents one document, right? Because it's a view entry. And so then I'm just passing that to a custom control and passing a handle on what document is being processed. So then inside there, we've got a couple other repeat controls. So you can nest these repeats as deep as you want to. Obviously, if you get too carried away, there's performance considerations to keep in mind. But it gives you a way to make your interfaces really flexible and provide something that's a little closer to the user experiences that people have come to expect from modern web applications and websites. So this is a repeat control, for instance. This is a repeat control. So the whole thing is a repeat, and we're just iterating view entries. But for each view entry, then we can nest additional repeat controls that provide some of these additional user interface vectors. So the easy one here is I've got a repeat that is just bound to the author name field for each document. So if there's only one author, then we only see one link. If there's multiple authors, then we see multiple links. And that's because inside it, we just have a link control. And then this you might find a little bit interesting. This is just computed text, and the value is just a comma and a space. But we've got a basic EL expression saying only show this computed text if the author index. So if you've used repeat controls before, you're probably used to setting a var. What is my variable going to be for each iteration of a repeat? But something that isn't used very frequently is the notion of an index var, where it actually exposes to you what's the number of the iteration that we're dealing with. So in this case, I'm checking to see if the author index is greater than 0. So in the context of this, being a repeat control, author index would evaluate to 0 here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so as a result, then we can inject a comma here, but only if we're dealing with a second author or further. So then the other nested repeat control that we have here is this rating container. So, and what's different about this is I'm not binding it to a collection. I'm just binding it to a number. I know that I'm always going to want 5 with something like author names or entry collections. I have no idea what data I'm going to be iterating, but I know it's going to be a group of one or more things. But in the case of these stars, I know I always want 5. I don't know which color I want for each, but I know I always want 5. So you can bind a repeat just to a number. And then inside here, I just have 2 images. So one of them shows up and this expression is a little bit fancy, but it's actually not that complex. We're just saying, look at the rating field on each document. Subtract what my index is. So on the first star, subtract 0, the second, subtract 1, and so forth. Check to see if that expression is greater than 0.49. And then in this case, is it less than 0.5? And so as a result then, we're just looking at the data, and if for each star, so this book was rated a 3.1. So the first 3 stars are yellow, the last 2 are gray. So that gives you something that you can just really easily, we're not even using JavaScript here, much less Java. We're just using basic EL to create something that in just a couple tags gives us a user interface vector that users respond to. So very quickly, the final demo I want to show is a notion of what I call infinite forms. We've all at some point either inherited or even created a form that has a notion of line items. So something like a purchase rec or an expense report, or something where you're going to fill out a series of fields to represent one concept, but you might need multiple rows. So what is typically done in the Notes client is, if I've got these 5 fields and we know we need up to 10 line items, then we've got 50 fields because we've created 10 rows in a table. And then somebody comes along and says, well, I've had a couple people saying that they've had 15 line items. Can you add more fields? And next thing you know, you've got 50 rows with 5 fields each. So what repeat controls allow you to do in this kind of situation is take advantage of the fact that the NSF data container is very flexible. You don't have to completely re-engineer things just because you want to add a new field. And XPages make great use of that. So in this case, I just start out with 1 row, and if I need another one, then I click add a row, and I've got another row. And then if I need another one, I can just keep adding more, etc. So this is actually surprisingly easy to do. I've created a hidden input for this form called item count, and I've set it to be a number, and a default value of 1. So then further down here, I've got a repeat control that's just bound to the value of that field. And then the add a row link, all it does is it checks what the current item value is, adds 1, and replaces the item value with the new number. So every time I click this, okay, now it's, now the repeat is iterating an additional row. And so then inside that, I just create, I've created this notion of a dynamic field custom control where you pass in the data source the field is going to be bound to and what the item name is. And then I've got a couple other fancies here, like you can pass in a converter and a placeholder, etc. But the basic premise is I can look at the item index like we did with the stars earlier and know that on the first row, this should be item description 0. The next row, it'll be item description 1. So for whatever the item name is, I'm passing that in as a placeholder as well. Normally with placeholders, you would pass in something useful like field level help. But in this case, I'm just passing the item name so that you can see these items will be named predictably then. And so if the user fills this out and then saves it, because the number of rows is part of the data now, when they come back, the repeat control is immediately going to know how many rows it needs to display. You don't have to analyze the data or anything. It just, you're storing how many rows, and therefore you know how many rows to display. But then whenever they initially come to create a document, you're not showing them this whole grid of data they don't necessarily need. You're showing them one line item, and they can add more if they need to. So I've probably gone over my time as well. So I will pass back control.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And just a reminder to all of our attendees, you can post your questions as we go along. and we'll field those questions at the end of the presentations. Our next speaker is Paul Withers. Paul is a senior Domino developer with Intech Systems out of, he's joining us out of Reading, UK, tomato. You can follow Paul at Paul Withers on Twitter. He is also an author of the XPages Extension Library, and if I haven't mentioned it, do buy that book. And he's also manages the blog at Intech as well, so you can follow him there as well. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so as has been mentioned, I'm going to be covering XPages language and performance, and this actually follows quite nicely on from Tim's bit that he was covering, where he was using expression language quite a bit. So what we're talking about with the languages here, when you compute a value or enter a value, there are 4 languages that are available. First is a literal value, so you enter a literal text string into a control value. The second one is expression language, which is usually used to bind to a value on a document, so document1.firstname, for example, and that starts with the hash with the curly braces, and as Tim just showed, that can also be extended to do things like comparisons. The third one is the most common one that developers would use, certainly when they're getting started, and that's server-side JavaScript. Now that looks, in terms of the outer constructs, quite similar to expression language, except that it's got this keyword, JavaScript : and then the server-side JavaScript code. And then if you look on the languages option, there's another one on there called custom, and many people probably haven't used that simply because it's not clear quite what it means. Well, it actually means that you can just combine all of the above. So you can put literal values in there, expression language, server-side JavaScript, all side by side, and I'll show an example of that shortly and why you would want to use it. So those are the languages that are available. Let's just step back and look at what's actually happening with your XPages. Most of your work will be in XPages, initially in the design pane, but then going into the source pane, which both Chris and Tim have used. And that uses an XML syntax to actually define controls and set their properties and build up the whole of the XPage with resources as well. But that's not what's actually run by the server. And that gets compiled down to Java classes. And so each control is a Java class. Each of the properties is set by calling a Java method on that Java class. And so expression language code is a string that's then passed to the Java method that basically runs getters and setters to go and get a value from a document or set a value into a document. Server-side JavaScript is passed in exactly the same way as that string, but that keyword method, that keyword JavaScript : tells it to run additional Java methods to extract that content, pick up where it's separated by semicolons, parse it and compute it, and the whole thing then prints out HTML to the browser. So why is that important? Well, it starts to become important when you step back and think that each of those controls is a Java class that each has properties that need to be set. So let's start thinking about that and think about what impact will using fewer controls on the XPage have, and how do the different languages affect performance. So to test that, I'm using a simple repeat control that just to really test its overall performance. That's a repeat running at 50,000 rows. So I'm showing 50,000 rows of data, and I've got multiple controls in there. There are 12 controls in all, some using literal strings, some using expression language, either referring to a variable as we are here with the index var, or referring to a field on a document. So let's look at the performance of that. So with text elements split, this is those 50,000 rows with 12 controls on each. Now this is really hitting it because the server that I'm running against is actually on the same laptop. So I really want to throw loads of data at it to emphasize the performance hit. But if you've got users with network latency, then they're going to see this much more. And that's taken just over 14 seconds of server processing time, and the size of the content that's been returned is 1.2 meg. Now, instead, let's look at using that custom property, a custom language. So, again, I've got literal strings, expression language, but it's all in one single computed field control. Now, it would make sense that because that's just one control compared to 12, it's going to have a bit of a performance enhancement. But it was only really when I ran this that I really saw exactly what an impact it actually has. So now instead of 14, just over 14 seconds, that's taken just over 8 seconds. So it's probably 60% of the time. But if we also look at the amount of data passed back to the browser, it's 920K compared to 1.2 meg. So you're saving time on the processing on the server. You're passing less data, so you're saving time on the interaction between server and browser. So it's starting to have a big impact. Now, obviously that means that if you've got all of that in one control, it makes it a bit harder to debug, but the performance benefits for users are quite significant. So now let's compare that. So that's 8.29 seconds. I'm just going to add on a bit onto the end to a bit of literal string to give the unit, and server-side JavaScript to retrieve that unit from the document. So that's so what we've got in there is just calling server-side JavaScript with user.getUniversalID. So from 8.29 seconds, so for what's effectively 12 controls as it was, that's that's kind of about 3/4 of a second for each. But with one bit of text and the unit is, and server-side JavaScript, it's added nearly 2 seconds, well, just over a second to the actual server processing time. So server-side JavaScript is going to take longer to run on the server than expression language, which will obviously take longer to run than literal text. So that means that there are real benefits where possible using expression language, and this kind of ties in with what Tim was doing with his rendered properties, where he was using expression language to compare index var to greater than 0 instead of using server-side JavaScript, which many of us would have used before. So just to summarize that, the fewer controls the better on your X page, because that means that there's less Java code to run. And combining languages has benefits, although it can be trickier to debug. Okay, now let's take that a step further. So I'm not so much looking at what the language is, I'm looking at where it's based. So for this I'm using that same repeat control of 50,000 rows, but I'm using a partial refresh on there as well. So for a start, I'm calculating that rendered property, which is very straightforward. It's literally just server-side JavaScript return true. So I'm calculating that in server-side JavaScript. Now the time for the initial page load is going to be quite a bit. It's going to be about just over 8 seconds again. But then I've got a partial refresh. And this is just recalculating that repeat control area with a formula on there that's just doing return true. And you can see that that's actually taken 9.4 seconds to run on the server by using a rendered property with server-side JavaScript. Now, if you want to reuse that across your whole application, then one of the ways that you might regularly do that is using a script library. And I want to show you a reason why I've certainly one of the reasons I've moved away from that is the performance hit of doing that. So with that partial refresh from about 9.6 seconds, and this script library is again just doing return true. It's now added about another 2 seconds just by placing that same return true function in a script library. Now there are various different ways that you can do it. You can store it in a Java function that's referenced via expression language. You can do a Java method that's returned a data context if it's regularly used within that X page is a good one. But one of the best in terms of performance is something called a variable resolver. And this allows that data to be stored in Java and referenced across the whole application. So that's 8.4 seconds for the initial page load, 8.42 for the actual running on the server. But it's then 9.27 seconds. So that actually runs even slightly quicker than the server-side JavaScript. that's on the X page. So whereas using a script library may seem a good way of doing it, script libraries are much worse on performance. If you can move to using Java, then that is better than script library, but it's still worse than server-side JavaScript on the X page itself, obviously. But the variable resolver does work best. And I did a blog post on that a few weeks ago, and there's a sample variable resolver that I put onto X snippets as well. So hopefully that will help you kind of think a bit more about what language you use, where you place that language as well, in terms of getting the best performance out of your X pages and tuning your X pages for performance.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And we're going to continue on with our last expert presentation. And joining us now will be Howard Greenberg, Executive Officer and my partner and co-founder here at TLCC. Howard's also an IBM champion along with our other 3 experts. And you can follow Howard on Twitter at TLCC Limited. Good morning, Howard. What are you going to share with us today?
Good morning, Paul, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. I'm going to kind of follow up with Paul Wither's talk about performance, but kind of looking at it from a little bit different way. And just kind of doing, had kind of a curiosity a couple of weeks ago about the app functions in XPages. Now, remember, when we're notes developers, the clear word was, hey, the app functions are going to give you your best performance compared to writing Lotus script, because those are built into, the client, and those will typically, be the fastest. It's kind of what a lot of people were saying. Now, when we look at the app functions in XPages, those really are just JavaScript libraries. So they're not quite as built into the Notes client as the app functions are there. So I was just curious to see how they actually performed. And keep in mind the app functions have a pretty wide variety of functionality, from text handling type app functions to things like @db lookup. But I just kind of confined my look to the @db lookup. So your other app functions might work completely different. And not to mention that in terms of development time, some of the app functions that handle list and text really do save more than a couple lines of code. Okay, so what I'm going to do, my base case is we're going to look up into a view, and we're going to retrieve one value, which is the city, for 5 of our customer documents. And this view has about 100 customers in it. Now, to have some nice, meaningful timings, I repeated that 200 times. So for each case we're going to look at, we actually are doing 1,000 lookups. Now, to do the timing, I use the XPages debug toolbar, which is on OpenNTF. And among the many functions this has, and if you're not using this, you need to be, because this is the best way to easily debug your XPages overall. There are other ways to debug Java code, and in 8.5.4 we're actually going to have a server-side JavaScript debugger, hopefully, rumor has it. But in terms of just general debugging, quickly finding out your scope variables and being able to print things out without having to do a print and looking at the server console, this is a great tool. And one of the functionalities it has is a timer. So I do have all the code. I'm not going to go through those on the slide. I'm going to switch to Designer. But I will put the code that you're going to see in the slides that you can download afterwards we're done, and you can view the presentations from everybody. So the first thing we'll look at is the @db lookup. So let me expand this. Here's our 5 customers I'm putting into an array. This is the way we start the timer. I'll just explain this in case you've never used the debug toolbar. There's a number of functions Mark had created that all start with dbar, and then we just say start timer and we give it a name. And we're going to have a stop timer and we give it a name. And then you'll see in a minute how we can view those timed results. So here's our loop. Our outer loop is repeated 200 times. And then we have an inner loop that goes through this array of 5 customers and just does an @db lookup. The view here is in the same database that the XPage is in. And this is on a server, but it's a local server here, so network latency is probably minimal. All right, so let's go see what we get here. Okay, so this is up top is the debug toolbar I was talking about, which I can actually hide if I want to. Let me refresh this so we can get a clean start. So I can hide the debug toolbar while we're while you're doing your testing, you can hide it. And then at the top we have different ways to look at our different variables, our scope variables, view scope variables, etc. And then there's the timer. Right now we don't have any timers. We haven't run any code with a timer in it. So I'll click on the @db lookup button, that code that you just saw, and you see that it's about 2,700 milliseconds. And I'll click on it again. I found the results are fairly close to each other every time I run through this code, definitely within 10%. So you see that took about 2,700, 2,800 milliseconds. Okay, so let's go back to the XPage and look at the next comparison. And again, I have an array with 5 customers. Now we're going to use the domino object model. So I have a document and a view. And again, I repeat 200 times. And I have an inner loop with an array with our customers. And so we do that lookup to get the 5 values for each customer, the 5 cities. And then we repeat that inner loop 200 times. So let's go back to our code. I'll click on that button. And you see that it's substantially quicker, almost 6 times quicker. So the kind of, I'm not quite sure what's going on underneath the covers with the @db lookup, but compared to doing the same thing in just the traditional domino object model, which I'm sure many of you folks who are fairly new to XPages have done that in LotusScript. So that should look kind of familiar. Okay, so let's go. I wanted to take this a step further, and one of the things as Domino developers we always hear is that the act of opening up a document to get a value is much slower than just getting it from a view index. So I thought, okay, well maybe that's the problem. Maybe if we just get that, just look at the view real quick. There's our view. And so we have that city value is in a column in the view. So instead of referencing the document using get document by key, why don't we just use the view entry and get the second column? That should be quicker. So in this code, I am doing just that. Instead of getting the document, I am getting the entry by key, and then I am using get column values to get the second column. Okay, so let's go look at that. So that's actually about the same speed, if anything, a little slower than opening up the document and getting that. So they're about the same. So there really wasn't a performance benefit there. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to look at, I kind of could have stopped here, but you know, we were doing some work with our Java course, and I thought, okay, Java has to be quicker. Everyone's saying Java, it won't have to do the conversion from JavaScript and convert it to Java, because in the end, remember, all XPages are Java. So what I did, and actually let me not show you this code first, let me show you the class I created. So I created using the new Java code element in 853, a class called customer info. And I created my own function called getCity, where I pass in a session and I pass in a string with the customer name. And then we get the view, and we get the document by key, do a get item value string to get the city, and then when I'm done, recycle the document, and we return the return result back to this Java method. So let's look at the code that calls that Java method. Again, we have our array with our 5 customers, and we create a new instance of the customer info Java class. Again, I have my loops, and I have the getCity method on that customer info. So this is just using Java, and let's see how that worked. So that actually was a little slower than the server-side JavaScript. And again, this is a fairly simple, set of code, so probably the overhead of linking to that Java method in that Java class is hiding the benefits Java is giving us in terms of performance. If there's something more complex going on in our Java class, I think that Java would end up being quicker. But for this simple act of retrieving some information from a document, it wasn't any quicker, and if anything, it was a little slower. Okay, so the next thing I thought, this every time in looking at the code from that we just ran, we're calling this method, and in that method we're having to get the view, and we're having to set up all these variables multiple times. So what would happen if we just did everything, including the looping, in Java? So we're actually only calling our Java method once, and we're doing all the iteration in the Java method. So there's only one time we're going after this Java method. So let's try that. And that is faster than what I had before, where I was calling the Java method 1,000 times, but not significantly quicker. That's 562 milliseconds. So that pretty much was it, but I did have one more thing I wanted to try, and that was, what if, obviously some of the overhead here is retrieving the notes document and getting to the view and interfacing with the Domino object model. So what if we read everything from the view and put it into memory, in this case I use the session variable. So in the before load event, the before page load event of our X page here, I am going to our view and getting all the entries, and I am putting it into a Java tree map. Now a Java tree map lets us store a value that we can reference by a key, and the key is the customer name. And then we can put an object in for the actual data that we want to store. In this case, I'm just storing a string, but we could store any type of Java object. And we use this syntax here, map.put, to read the results or store the results out to our tree map. And then we store the tree map into a view scope variable called customers. So now in our button here, I just have to look up everything from the tree map. So I got that view scope customers I actually put that back into a variable called customer map or custmap, and I did the 2 loops again. This time I was just using a method on the tree map class, the Java tree map, called get, and I pass it the key, and it returns what was stored in that tree map. So let's try that. That was 16 milliseconds. So now we've really sped up those 1,000 lookups by just reading that out of memory to 16 milliseconds, and when I run it again, it's 0. It kind of alternates between 0 and 15 or 16. So clearly that's the quickest. So if we were doing a lot of lookups into a view that wasn't 1,000, you're obviously not going to do this with a view with 100,000 documents because you're going to not have enough memory. But if you have a small view that you're doing a lot of lookups to, maybe some variables that control how your application behaves, reading everything into memory at the start is going to be your quickest way to go. Okay, so going back to, actually that's all I have here. I do have the timing results and all the code in the charts that I will post up on the, when we send out the email to everybody with the recorded webinar link, we'll have the slides. So Paul, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Howard. And we're going to open it up to question and answer. And again, post your questions in the questions area in GoToWebinar, and then I'll relay those to our various experts. And if you want to address them to one of our specific experts, you can certainly put that in your question. Okay, so I have a question from Martin, and we'll just open this up to all the panelists. How can I use access control roles to control the visibility for various components, input fields, text lines, tabs, and so on? Who wants that? I guess there's a few ways to do that. Anyone?
Well, I'll take it. There's a couple ways. One would be, if you're referencing the role in rendered or loaded. The loaded gives you a little better performance because it determines that at page load time, and it doesn't keep recalculating it. And also, your ACL is not likely to change during the same session. So, so that would be my recommendation. The only downside of loaded is that then it doesn't even exist on the page. So if you need other things that they do see to reference stuff that they can't see, then it's not going to be available. So I'm not sure that
the other option.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
The other option is at any level that you can have data, so an XPage custom control or down to panel. On the All Properties tab, there is under the data area ACL, so you can set their entries for based upon a name, based upon a group, based upon a role, and define access settings at that level. Tim, I have a vague recollection that I've heard some people saying that there were problems with that. Are you aware?
Yes, I was about to offer just one word of caution, which is if you're going to have users that authenticate against directory assistance, there is a bug with those types of data or types of page-specific ACLs, and I believe it actually crashes servers. So if everybody's just logging in standard nav, you're fine. But if you've got additional directories defined via directory assistance. Anybody trying to authenticate against those directories and then opening a page that has a page-specific ACL, it does tend to fail.
Just an
Let me add, Paul. Hold on. Let me just add to this one. There is a in the extension library. There is a I think it's called user roles.
User bean.
User bean, and that will provide information about the roles too, I believe, in addition to what their access level is and things like that.
Roles and groups, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, and so that could be used too as the user bean from the extension library. And then David Weedy also, thanks David, put in the questions that there is a snippet in the OpenNTF, and it was called Getting Checked ACL Role. He put a whole URL in, which I'll copy to the chat if I can.
To throw an idea out there, and this is Chris, to throw an idea out there, depending on the complexity of, or the need, or the potential need of the given roles. Let's say you have an application and you have 3 roles, submitter, manager, and executive. The executive is probably not going to need to see the same UI that the requester is, nor should the manager. And let's just say that those are greatly different UIs. Once you define a data source, especially if you're defining that data source via query string parameter, database name, document ID, et cetera, the fields become, you don't have to have all the fields on an X page in order to write back to that notes document in order to update that data source. So you can use an include page and literally have, you can use custom control for that matter, but you can use an include page to create completely dynamic and separate UIs for a given request if we're using the example application. Completely separate UIs that are catered to that individual. And this also gives you the ability, while you're developing, to quickly test that without swapping out roles, because then you can just pull up that individual page and pass it to data source via query string parameter. So it'll allow you to quickly, you can speed up development time and turnaround time for that app by using that type of technique. Now, if you're talking about disabling a field or hiding a particular row, then yes, absolutely, what everyone else said. And on panels, you can also set, and to extend that, on panels there's a read-only attribute. So if you're defining a form and then a parent panel as the first child within that XP form that sets the data source, and then you can create individual subpanels that actually lock down the controls underneath of it. So it all depends on how you architect that stuff out, but you can get really tricky with, okay, well, I've locked this down, use loaded, or if you got the opportunity, really wow them and say, hey, executive, you didn't need to see the back and forth between the manager and the requester about a mouse. You just need to know that, this manager's approved 10,000 lice purchases in the past 2 weeks, and here's the breakdown of each on the screen. So there's always that option as well.
Okay. Another question related to performance, but just before I do, there's been a number of questions about can we get the sample demonstrations or databases that the various folks were presenting. Now, that's not an easy thing to do centrally. We are going to distribute a recording and the overall presentation. But for the samples, I know, Howard, you mentioned you're going to post it at our site. If the other experts can comment whether or not their samples are going to be available, maybe in a blog the next time you're talking, that'd be great too. So another question about performance. If you have a poor performing notes client application, Can you actually improve the performance by taking that to an XPage application?
Almost always.
I think you've also got to bear in mind that one of the most obvious poor performing areas are views, and in the Notes client you've got to wait until that whole view loads before you can use it. In an XPage, unless you use the always calculate last property, it will search through, if you're showing 30 documents at a time, it will load 30, go through a few pages to see if it can get to the end, and then stop. So instead of going through and loading the whole view, it's loading much less data, so that's going to improve performance.
As a corollary to that, since it does allow you to create much more flexible user interfaces, if you give your users more effective search and navigation techniques, then I'm going to open a view and scroll till I find what I want. Then having 200 views in the same database to be able to find the data they need and generate the reports that they need becomes far less critical. And as Paul mentioned, almost always the best way to gain performance is don't have as many views and don't have as complex of views. So
and also the views, you can pull information from different documents. In the Notes client, you've got to have all that information on the document that's showing in view. So if you have a contact document, you need the company name on there. With XPages, you don't necessarily need to have all that information. There is going to be a slight performance hit, but because you're showing fewer documents in the page, that's usually going to be a less of a performance hit. But it means that you can combine views. You can pull in information from different areas of the database, and that could actually mean that you need fewer views in the underlying database.
Howard also touched on the notion of using the scoped variables to be able to cache certain information, and by default, none of that is cached, other than, I mean, IBM's done all sorts of optimizations to make sure that XPages perform as well as possible, but then you have absolutely fine-grained control. And just a recap for those that either haven't encountered these or haven't in a while, there are four main scope levels: request, view, session, and application. View scope actually has nothing to do with domino views in the terminology we're used to. View refers to the V of MVC, Model View Controller. So view just means the page I'm on, the user interface I'm interacting with. So view scope is great because if you cache stuff when the page loads and you put it in view scope, then anytime somebody fires an event against that page, it doesn't have to re-perform whatever expensive thing you did to determine what that data was. So in some cases, you can be pulling data from all over the internet into one cohesive interface, but then you don't have to go back out to wherever you got that data because you just store it in memory, and then when they navigate to another page, then it clears that out for you automatically.
I'm going to cut us off. We have a lot of questions here. So let's take a look at the next one here. What's the best way to debug server-side JavaScript?
Well, the best way is probably to wait to 8.5.4 because there's a rumored server-side JavaScript debugger coming out. Failing that, the XPages debug toolbar is great because you can use that to print out messages, kind of like the the message box that we might have done with LotusScript. You can, of course, use print statements in your server-side JavaScript, but those print statements appear on the server console. If the XPage is running on a console, if it's running in your local web preview, it goes to a log file, which is, you got to dig up and keep refreshing that. So the debug toolbar really does help a lot there if you're working locally, if you have a server right next to you or you're remote remote it into the server, just using print statements is very helpful too. I don't know if Tim, if you've found any other debug tips.
No, that's definitely the best one out there right now, the debug toolbar. Medusa was pretty powerful when it still worked, but 852 broke it, and we haven't had an opportunity to update it. But the debug toolbar does a lot of what we were trying to accomplish with Medusa anyway.
Okay, next question. Has anyone ported the Twitter Bootstrap framework into XPages? If not, is this practical or not?
I was listening to Taking Notes this morning, the episode with Matt White and Mike Myers. And if you listen to that, then Matt White's been doing some stuff with that recently. And he's using the Twitter Bootstrap and jQuery, and his feedback on it is that it works very well.
Okay. I have a question from Robert. What's the best practice for designing an XPage as far as the Domino documents go and storage? Before XPages, the design was all handled by the NSF, but now we have some options in XPage development in terms of the document schema. So any best practices there?
I tend to worry a lot less about storing everything on a particular document and using multiple documents much more, because it's very easy to pull information from other documents. So if I'm adding comments, for example, or an audit trail previously, I may have put that all on that particular document, whereas now I'm much more flexible about creating child documents or related documents. But that's just a personal preference, really.
Something that also helps performance is actually splitting your data out into separate NSF containers. Data segregation always speeds up performance because, again, then the view indexes become less complex that way. So if you have, say, a CRM, having your company records and your contact records and interaction records, or whatever, all of the stuff the CRM contains, if you actually spread that out across multiple containers, a single XPage can reach into all those and present the relationships between the data in a coherent fashion to the user. But in a strict storage perspective, then you're using that segregation to make your view indexes less complex, and then everything's going to be faster. But obviously then, as the question implied, we don't even have to have everything in NSF. So if you want to store stuff in Couch or Hadoop or graph databases or whatever, you've got that option. Obviously, the fastest in terms of development time is going to be NSF, but stuff like the social business toolkit, et cetera, actually allows us to define additional, maybe we want to store some of this data in connections, and so ultimately it's going to be living in DB2. Then that gives you a little bit more scalability, et cetera. So those are just some of my thoughts.
I know that Ulrich Kraus has also used the JDBC Access project for reporting over a large database, and that really helped him on performance of reporting over difficult data, because that's reporting that allows you to query a Domino database using SQL queries, so that can actually perform better than actually using the view indexes.
Tim, I'm going to extend that question with my own question here. So we already have our application data split among several databases. So from a design perspective, what is the best practice? Should all of your XPages and support design elements be in a single database that is touching those multiple NSF data sources, or should they be spread?
Yes. I've had the best success with consolidating the design. So in a lot of cases, and I've seen customers respond well to this approach. Whatever contains your XPages only contains your XPages, and so you don't actually have any data in that application. All of your user interface design elements are there, and you're not spreading those across multiple. But then it's reaching into a half dozen or so different places to get the data. Now, the primary reason, in my opinion, that it's best to consolidate all the design into one is because of the way that scopes are managed. So we don't have an IBM provided scope right now that is larger than an NSF. So if you go from an XPage in one NSF to an XPage in another NSF, you're dealing with a different session scope and a different application scope. So if you've defined some structure for sort of a shopping cart type, users are interacting with the app in some way, and you want it to remember that from page to page. If you jump to an XPage in a different NSF, everything that was stored is still stored in the other NSF or associated with the other NSF. But the NSF they've been redirected to is not aware of that. So if you drop all the design into one, then you can leverage the caching in the session scope and application scope across pages and even users. But then your data may be scattered all over the place, but your app is all one thing.
Okay.
I could add something to that just from a different viewpoint, if you will. I think we've all inherited some application, and I know I have, and the developer was on some new hotness kick at the time that was going to be the cutting edge of how they developed this thing, and that's now been a deprecated practice for 5 years, and you look at the code, you're like, what the heck is this? Oh, it's stored over here. I forgot people were actually doing that. Oh, can you believe that they did that? Ha, 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 funny, funny. Now, if you're creating an XPages version of an existing application, obviously, you create an external database or create the XPages in the NSF that you're sourcing the data out of. You point right to the forms, you point to the views. There's no question the stuff's already existing. If you're creating a new one, I used to say, hey, I don't even care about the forms. I don't need a form. It wires the pretty panel UI that I don't use anyway, and thanks, Tim, for coining that phrase, pretty panel. But the more and more I develop, the more I see forms, the forms in particular, as an opportunity to document as I code. So I'll create a form design element, throw the fields in there, and they're not to be used as UI user-facing forms. But if I have to pull up the form to figure out what the heck document is, then I'm going to pull that up and say, oh, okay, here's all the documentation, and here's where this goes, and here's where that goes. So while I'm in Designer, I don't have to crack open this design synopsis document that never, quite frankly, gets written. I don't know about you, but I don't document my designs. So if I'm in Designer and can do it there, I'm future-proofing that scenario if and when I get hit by a bus and someone else has to take over that application. So a different way of looking at what we're talking about. It's not really from a scalability or best practices as far as speeding up development, but certainly be able to go back in 6 months or 5 years later into an application, varying in time range, bear with, to be able to go back in there and say, oh, okay, I get what this application is doing, as opposed to, wait, we're using resource bundles to define data sources remote to this database on another way, I'm lost.
Yeah, also just picking up what Tim said on the sessions scope is that also if your design is split across multiple databases, then when you log out or the user logs out, you can very easily set session scope to null for that database, but it starts getting difficult to clear session scopes on other databases to clear the session scope across the whole server. And it did take me quite a while to track out how to do that. And I've just posted it into the chat a link to an X snippet that I put up to actually clear that session scope across the whole server. So getting all your design into a single NSF is going to make it easier for handling scope variables and clearing scope variables at the end of the process.
Okay, let's move on to another question. Simon had a question about how to implement form inheritance that in moving, from the Notes client to XPages, and he was doing that through the post new document, but was wondering if there's any better way of doing that. And in my mind, I don't think there really is much of a better way of doing that. Does anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, IBM unfortunately did not include, they have the notion of responses, right? Because you can say, oh, well, this has a parent document ID. So the easiest way to do it really is if you define multiple document data sources. So you would have your primary data source, and that's sort of, say you got like a discussion database, or so you got your primary discussion thread, you've got your responses. So you want to create an XPage that allows you to create a response to a discussion topic. So you'd have your primary document data source, and that's going to be for the response document that's going to be generated. But on the same XPage, if you define a second data source that that is actually bound to the original document, then each of your fields, all your input texts and whatever, you would bind the value to the response data source and the default value property to the original document. So then, whenever that page loads, it's going to look at the parent document ID and see, oh, well, here's the discussion thread, so I'm going to default this field value to whatever the value is on the original data source, but then the value itself is bound to the response data source. So if you do a save, then the values are only written to the response document.
One just caveat on that is to remember on the parent document data source, remember to set ignore request params equals true, because otherwise, even if you yes. tell it a unit that and a form, it's actually picking up the same document that you're currently editing.
And you'll probably want to also set that data source to read only.
Yeah.
Because if you're using the standard simple actions to do the save, they'll probably try to save back to the original document, and if they don't have access, it might throw an error, even though they're not actually writing any new fields, because you're only binding default values, not values. But it's still going to try to stamp that document anyway.
Just a quick add-on to that. Just thinking outside the box here, I I would see if that requirement still exists if you move over to XPages completely. A lot of the development techniques that we've used over the years are a result of, well, that's how we did it in Notes. So we set up form inheritance because, well, that was the only way that we could get this to display with this, so you could see, oh, well, if it's a contract document, you're doing document revision, stuff like that. Absolutely, you know, what they said. But if you're doing it because, well, we needed a UI to do this, then I would evaluate and see if the old way of doing it, and that's one of the things that we do when we transform or evolve an XPages app. We actually engage and say, what do you need this to do? Not, okay, I'm going to take this 100% fidelity because that's how it looks in the Notes client. That's exactly how it looks or has to look in the XPages browser version. Because crap in, crap out.
Chris, I know we're short for time, but I think that's actually a really crucial point you just made. Not just to individual app requirements, but to actually the process of learning XPages. So what I've found talking to a whole bunch of XPages developers is for every single one of us, myself included, the initial instinct is to ask, this is what I used to do in Notes. What is the precise functional philosophical equivalent in XPages? And I struggled learning XPages until I stopped asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
Once you stop asking that, then say, okay, well, I won't forget everything I ever learned, but I'm no longer going to rely on that. I'm going to learn this. And as soon as I did that, it got easy because I'm like, okay, blank slate. Let me learn this platform. And in no time, I wasn't even trying to do the things I used to do anymore because my customers weren't asking for those things when I wasn't enforcing those limitations and assumptions upon them.
Okay. Quick question from Smriti, and perhaps someone can simply post the download to the debug toolbar.
Well, it's on.
I'm kind of locked out right now, but if someone can just post that to the general chat, that would be great.
Yeah, it's on OpenNTF, and when you they have, if you go to projects, they have a drop-down listing all the projects, and it's not XPages debug toolbar, it's XPage debug toolbar. So we'll find that and post it. But
okay.
Robert had a question, which is one that actually I've run into about, he is a customer that has a website design that was created by, you know, a graphics artist or some non-Domino person, and I assume he just handed him a bunch of HTML and style sheets and things like that. And that's actually, you know, what we did here at TLCC going back 10, 12 years ago. I forget when we have the, you know, the current site design. And we got a bunch of HTML and style sheets and put those into subforms, and then use those subforms to wrap that around our content, depending on whether it's a view or a document we're displaying, you know, whatever the case may be. And so you can do the same thing with XPages. You can create custom controls that have the look and feel and put into that your HTML. Because XPages in the source control or source view, you can have pure HTML, and then in the resources section of the XPage, you can bring in your style sheets and any client-side JavaScript libraries that your other, you know, the website designer might have given you to do fancy things. And then you can bring those custom controls onto your XPage as needed. And so it's kind of a similar paradigm as, you know, we did with the Domino web development and pass-through HTML.
And
where
Paul,
you have that.
The key to that technique typically is these editable areas. Because
Yes.
XPages are XML, so they have to be valid XML. I remember years ago, Jay Hallett bemoaning the fact that he couldn't do what he used to do in Domino, which was, I'm going to start my HTML tags in one subform and end them in another. He couldn't reproduce that with custom controls. What was missing from that was the notion of editable areas. So instead of creating one subform or one custom control to start your tags and one to end them, if you just create one and it's all your tags, and like you said, don't even use XPages controls, just use the standard, pass-through HTML, so to speak. But then you drop an editable area in there, and then every page that you want to use that layout, you drag on that one control, then drag into that a div or a panel, and then boom, drop all of the page-specific stuff right into there.
And Tim, I would even go, actually in my implementation, I went a step further in that the menus that display at the top, well, some pages I don't want menus, so I actually have that be an editable area. Even parts of the interface are editable areas that I can drag and drop, things like a Facebook like button or stuff like that. So
right.
you can have multiple editable areas, one for your main content, but other editable areas for parts you want to customize as you go through the site and have different functionality for the pages.
And what that essentially gives
one thing, just
go ahead, Paul.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Slightly tangential.
The result of what it sounds like you're describing is that it allows you to create your own custom version of what the application layout component from the extension library does. So that component in the XLib is something where you drag one component in and you set in properties, here's what my links are going to be in this area and here's what this text is going to be, etc. And they do leave editable areas throughout. But you can also create your own entirely custom one, I think the way you're describing, where you say, okay, here's an editable area for where the navigation is going to go. Here's an editable area for where the company or site logo is going to go. Here's an editable area for the copyright text, etc. And so those custom controls can have some default stuff in there, but then each piece you can customize on every page. I think that's what you were getting at, right?
One thing
Chris,
just to bear in mind is that if someone, if you get a CSS that is used for a corporate website that's not XPages, just do be aware that if you never hit any CSS conflicts, you've been extraordinarily lucky. At some points, you're going to get a conflict between that and the One UI styling or the Dojo styling or something somewhere. So just bear in mind that you will need time for that.
Okay, Chris, you had a URL you posted. You want to explain that related to this topic?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I would strongly suggest is that you reboot XPages. Now, there's a URL that's going out that tells you exactly how to do that, and that is not including any of the Dojo libraries, any of the basically anything that makes XPages functional at the client level. Because if you're just turning around a website that's based on HTML, you're going to want to load and control at a complete level what is being delivered to the browser. And I do this with mobile development a lot, that I don't want the entire Dojo library to come down. Now, you can create a layout or a layout type control like I did in my demo that did the border container layout that includes all the libraries that you'll need and injects them based on the given client type. However, if you want to start with blank HTML body, closed body, that close HTML tag, that link will show you exactly how to do it, and from there you've got complete vanilla. You can build on top of it. Create a custom control and completely properties enable it. If you remember during my long-winded presentation, I went into my layout underscore screen custom control, which did generate my entire layout. However, I was passing through with callbacks and a div that shared the facet name to that callback to the actual content. So that allows me, I can take that layout underscore screen control and plop it into any X page, and boom, I've got my basic layout. Now let me customize it to my individual needs. And one thing that I tend to stress towards developers, you're building these controls, or you're building the X page, and it's XPages is a delivery mechanism. It delivers markup to a browser, regardless of the client. It delivers that markup. Now, it's also delivering client-side JavaScript libraries that can function against some of that markup to create user interface design, really slick-looking features. However, XPages at its core, from the client side, is just a markup delivery mechanism. If you reset it back to this is an X page, hello world type of stuff where there's no client-side JavaScript libraries or anything loaded, you can completely control what's delivered to a given device, a web browser in this case.
Just be aware that if you do that kind of reset, it completely breaks events. So certainly this approach is great for if you have like a read-only type interface, because then you have all the power of XPages in delivering, as you said, that markup, determining what that markup should be, going out and getting the data and so forth. But then any user interactivity you're going to have to hand code yourself, because it breaks all the built-in event functionality of XPages.
Okay, I've got another question from Michael. Are there server settings that can help with XPages and Java performance? This is a topic of next month's webinar, I believe.
Just one that comes to mind immediately is the default max heap size is, in my opinion, set ridiculously low. So I always jack that way up.
Yeah, I'd recommend if you're looking at anything on settings for performance, XPages Portable Command Guide book is excellent.
Yes, definitely. Because one of the settings, and I like joking with the admins about this, that all the admins I know are amazing at supporting mail, and haven't quite, come up to speed on how to support apps. They know all about Deos, they know all about Traveler, but when I ask them, if I hand you this app, and I tell you, irrespective of the code, this app needs to scale to a whole bunch of users, and this other app isn't going to have many users, but it needs to be really fast. And then this third app, somewhere in the middle, happy medium. What one setting as an admin should you set in each of those apps? Completely irrespective of the code. If you read the XPages Portable Command Guide, you'll know the answer to that question.
Okay, I have a question from Robert. How do author and reader fields work in XPages? I'm going to extend that, assuming they do work. What are the implications of implementing those, and how do you implement those?
Basically, with server-side JavaScript or Java in your save is the only way. There's nothing to actually bind a field, bind a control to an author's field and define it as an author's field. If you just bind that to an author's field and save, then it's just going to be saved as a text field, unless you do compute reform.
You didn't just say that, did you?
You wouldn't want to do that, but that's the only way if you're going to bind it to the field. The best way is in your save code handle, setting it to an author's field or a reader's field.
Paul, that sounds like that would be a really useful custom converter.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Watch for that in one of the blogs. It's going to be a race now for who's going to get that custom converter out first.
Get right on that, lady.
How are we doing for time?
Well, I think we're maybe take one more question. There was one by Martin, which I think, Tim, you would know the best. If I create Java class files via the Package Explorer, not using the new Java design element, how are these files affected by database design refresh? Do they get refreshed, and is there any way to prevent them if they do?
I've had big problems with that in 852 particularly. 852, in order to refresh them down, if you just do a design refresh, everything looks as if it's fine, but you won't get the changes. The only way I've got it to work with 852 is to delete the class file, delete the Java files from the target database, then refresh design, and then do a clean in order to get them to update. 853, I think it's slightly better, but in terms of preventing design refresh, you probably need to do something to bear in mind these are still notes effectively in the NSF. You can probably do something to set the prohibit design refresh setting on that.
Yeah, you can programmatically get a handle on those notes using note collection. You'd have to. I don't recall off the top of my head what the dollar flags are for that. But if you loop through a note collection that just says "Give me all the design," then you can probably divine from the dollar title when you've hit those source files, and as much you could probably then stamp that block design item from there.
It's probably easier just to upgrade 853 and use the Java design element.
Yeah, most likely. Although I have personally witnessed a certain amount of instability with that Java design element.
I've heard of people saying that it's just disappeared.
Right. So there's a little bit of unpredictability with that as well. What I've actually found to be an interesting approach is where you don't actually create the Java classes directly within the NSF, but if you create them as a separate project just in vanilla Eclipse and then define a linked source folder within the NSF, when you do the build, then the class files get in there, the actual compiled classes. It's going to run exactly the way you want it to. But then the NSF doesn't actually contain the source files. The source files then you could have in SVN or Git or whatever. And then using Domino's built-in template inheritance becomes a little less important if you use that approach. But that's a bit more convoluted of a design practice.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our webinar today. I would like to thank all of our XPages experts and everyone who attended today. Be sure to watch this space for our next webinar. And also do expect an email with links to the presentation and to the recording as well. Anyone care to add anything in sign-off?
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thanks to everyone who attended, and also to our presenters, who Chris and Tim and Paul, who took their time to join us today and help the community learn more about XPages.
Thanks for having me, and I'll post my demo database on my blog.
Same here.
Thanks.
Okay, everyone have a great day.